Hi there, my name is Mr. Doyle, and this is a great undertaking. On this channel, I am exclusively discussing all the works of Stephen King and the endless adaptations across every imaginable medium for which they have been used and abused according to the order of the original book or story's publication. In this series, I will be diving into King's sixth published book, The Stand. This first video in the series will be focused on the novel itself. Then in the upcoming videos, we will take a look at the 1994 CBS TV miniseries, followed by the comic books which began publishing in 2008, the 2013 illustrated poem entitled The Dark Man, and finally, the most recent 2020 TV series which debuted on CBS All Access. The Stand remains one of King's best-selling novels of all time, and is a story that saw a renewed sense of relevance during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and of course with the, depending on how you look at it, either perfectly or perhaps terribly timed release of the most recent screen adaptation of the story during the pandemic. I like to get into character for each series, so for The Stand I'll be rocking this sweet Randall Flagg-inspired Canadian tuxedo, complete with smiley face pin. Synopsis as provided within the novel. The old Chevy came out of the Texas dusk at near walking speed, a Pandora's box of nightmare and death. Up ahead, the lights of Bill Hapscom's Texaco station glimmered. The box was about to be opened, the dance of death about to begin. But the survivors of the dance have learned to fear something much worse than death, because the Dark Man is on his way. He is known as Randy Flagg, the Walkin' Dude, the man with no face. He is a drifter with 100 different names. He is the Magic Man. He is the living image of Satan. His hour come round again. He has summoned the weak and corrupted to his side, and the rest have been warned. Sooner or later, you will have to do battle for your lives, and more than your lives. Sooner or later, you will have to make your stand. The Stand is a story of dark wonders and irresistible terror, an epic of final confrontation between good and evil. History and inspiration. Originally published in 1978, the first publication of The Stand was essentially an abridged version due to the publisher, Doubleday, requiring approximately 400 pages be removed from the story. Doubleday claimed that the uncut novel would be simply too expensive to print, which would subsequently drive up the purchase price of the novel. King begrudgingly made the cuts, however the novel would later see an unabridged publication through Doubleday in 1990, which was billed as the complete and uncut edition. This edition would become, and remains to this day, to be King's lengthiest publication at a whopping 1,152 pages. In addition to the reinstatement of the previously cut pages, King updated the story, which originally took place in the 80s, to instead be set in the 90s. Additionally, Doubleday published a deluxe edition of The Stand, the complete and uncut edition, limited to 1,250 numbered copies and 52 lettered copies. This edition came to be known as the Coffin Box Edition due to the book being housed in a wooden case, and was additionally signed by King. While I couldn't find any of these coffin box editions currently available for purchase, I did track one down that had previously sold for upwards of $4,000. Reception for The Stand from literary critics and readers alike has been almost universally positive since its original release. The Stand was nominated for a World Fantasy Award for Best Novel in 1979, and the book has sold over 4.5 million copies, a number which doesn't take into account the innumerable purchases of secondhand copies, digital sales, and audiobooks. When taking these factors into consideration, it's safe to say that more than 10 million people have read or experienced the book in some fashion. According to King, The Stand was his take on the epic fantasy novel. inspired by classics such as The Lord of the Rings, only in a modern American setting. He wanted to write about an incredible journey in which the large cast of characters would face insurmountable odds and, in some cases, meet with great peril, while on a quest to save the world from an evil, powerful force. King stated, quote, "Instead of a hobbit, my hero was a Texan named Stu Redman, and instead of a dark lord, my villain was a ruthless drifter and supernatural madman named Randall Flagg. The land of Mordor, where the shadows lie, according to Tolkien, was played by Las Vegas," unquote. There were 3 additional sources of inspiration for The Stand, including a chemical spill in Utah, a segment on chemical biological warfare that King saw on TV, and the novel Earth Abides by George R. Stewart. In the case of the Utah chemical spill, there were some containers which contained a toxic cocktail that, while in transit to be disposed of, fell from the bed of a truck, causing them to break and leak their contents. Here are some of the gory details of this specific incident. The Dugway Sheep Incident, also known as the Skull Valley Sheep Kill, was a March 1968 incident that has been connected to United States Army chemical and biological warfare programs at Dugway Proving Ground in Utah. 6,000 sheep were killed on ranches near the base, and the popular explanation blamed Army testing of chemical weapons for the incident, though alternative explanations had been offered. A report commissioned by Air Force press officer Jesse Stay and first made public in 1998 was the first documented admission from the Army that a nerve agent killed the sheep at Skull Valley. King recalled a reporter at the time remarking that had the wind been blowing the other way, it easily could have been the residents of Salt Lake City who met with this terrible fate. King also cites a segment from the show 60 Minutes as having made a lasting impression on him that would influence the direction of The Stand. In this particular segment, the effects of chemical biological warfare were being tested on mice, and in King's words, quote, "I never forgot the gruesome footage of the test mice shuddering, convulsing, and dying, all in 20 seconds or less," unquote. And finally, King cites Earth Abides, a 1949 post-apocalyptic science fiction novel by author George R. Stewart, as having been influential to The Stand, and the parallels between the stories are many. Earth Abides is set in the 1940s and tells the story of the fall of civilization from deadly disease and the emergence of a new culture. The story's protagonist emerges from isolation in the mountains to find almost everyone dead. He embarks on a cross-country journey in search of resources and survivors, and becomes a part of a new civilization that develops in the aftermath of the disaster. Sounds familiar. Additionally, the novel explores what would happen to Earth, the environment, and non-human inhabitants, plants and animals for instance, in the absence of human influence. The overview. The Stand is a post-apocalyptic battle for the souls of mankind, but it is much more than that. While maintaining the central premise of the age-old biblical war of good versus evil, King addresses a variety of topics which are relatable to everyday readers. Trust issues, isolation, self-doubt, grief, desperation, power, faith. So much of what King writes about in this novel is deeply seated in the collective human psyche and comprises the vast range of human emotion we all experience during our lives. In spite of the fantasy elements and extraordinary circumstances, we are able to see ourselves reflected in so many of the story's characters. Similarly to King's first novel, Carrie, we find ourselves connecting on a visceral level with the story's protagonists, and in some cases, as much as we may not care to admit it, with a few of the antagonists as well. Even before the Captain Trips virus is underway in earnest, we meet characters who are facing their own personal life crises, and while in many cases their unfortunate or dire situations are exacerbated by the plague, in some cases it frees them of those circumstances. The predicaments they have found themselves in or lifelong problems they have faced are suddenly irrelevant or washed away entirely, delivering them from oppressive societal stigmas that were beyond their control. Or in other instances, relieving them of the consequences of their own adverse, injurious, conscious actions. While we meet characters who are deliberately nefarious, as well as those who are inherently good, we also understand that others are victims of circumstance or unwitting pawns on an ethereal chessboard, helpless to the inclinations of unseen forces who use them to further their ends. We find that while they all have a modicum of control or choice, it is ultimately a force far greater than individual efficacy or virtue that determines their path. Each character is defenseless against their fate. They are at the mercy of the whims of destiny and divine intervention. And as a reader, it's this idea of the helplessness to escape the clutches of the powers that be that frightens me the most. King preys on our empathy as well as our selfishness and forces us to be introspective. He kicks open the locked doors of our self-assuredness and forces us to question, what would I have done in this situation? What path would I have taken? Which side of the Rocky Mountains would I have ended up on? And would I have had any choice in the matter? As much as we would all like to believe that we would have been on the side of good, on the right side, it leaves you wondering whether through your own faults or forces beyond your control, if in this story you might have ended up in Vegas instead of Boulder. And if you're not sure about where you would have ended up, well, I guess that's something we have in common. In addition to the holy war and the individual struggles it portrays, The Stand depicts the breakdown of society in the face of a deadly global threat. Now, thankfully, the COVID-19 pandemic the planet has been impacted by for well over a year now is far less lethal than the fictional Captain Trips virus. However, the parallels regarding the breakdown of society, the innumerable tragic deaths, and the disruption of life as we knew it are hard to ignore. If nothing else, the devastation in The Stand could be used as a measure of how much worse things could be. But while it feels like things may be inching toward getting better, it would also be naive to suggest that once the COVID-19 pandemic is under control, that all of our problems will be over. Much like the story of The Stand, it is in the aftermath of disaster that societies must assess the damage, reevaluate their priorities, and figure out how to move forward. Things inevitably start to return to a semblance of normalcy following the devastation of Captain Trips, and it is Glenn Bateman, the novel's token atheist and man of science, that recognizes the dangers of this return to the way things were. And this is perhaps one of the most relevant moments in this story that is applicable to the reality of our current predicament. Going back to normal isn't a viable option. And before I have an opportunity to go on a political tirade that will inevitably reveal my biases and ideology, the protagonists. There are numerous integral protagonists in The Stand, each of which has their own defining personality traits, characteristics, and struggles. Stu Redman is a blue-collar everyman. He isn't particularly charismatic or controversial. He isn't a complex or extraordinary man. He is generally unremarkable, or at least that's the man he is when we are first introduced to him. Throughout the course of the novel, Stu finds himself being thrust into a position of leadership, and we come to find that he is not the seemingly dispassionate, simple man we may have thought him to be. Franny Goldsmith is a young woman who has found herself in a precarious predicament that will inevitably alter the course of her life. However, as the Captain Trips virus invades her small hometown, she discovers that her world has only just begun to turn upside down. Frances is headstrong, but she is fearful for her future, as well as for the future of someone dear to her who has yet to arrive. Glenn Bateman is a deep thinker, a philosopher, and an atheist. He doesn't believe in the supernatural or in God, but following the near extinction of the human race, he finds he is forced to question everything he has ever believed and come to terms with the fact that there are indeed unseen forces guiding his fate and the fate of humanity. Nick Andros is deaf and mute, and an introspective wanderer who finds himself shouldering a burden he never anticipated. Several burdens, in fact. He is a compassionate, empathetic individual who, when faced with making hard choices, seems to always know what to do and what is right. Tom Cullen is a developmentally disabled adult who has a heart of gold and a great deal more ability to reason than he is given credit for. Tom is an unshakable ally and a reliable friend who can be counted on when the chips are down. Tom is among the most unwitting of the protagonists, and it is not only fate, but his allies who are willing to potentially sacrifice him in the name of the greater good. Larry Underwood is an up-and-coming rock star who, in the midst of his heyday, discovers that he doesn't like the man he has become. His story is one of self-loathing and regret, as well as redemption and atonement. But it takes the end of civilization as he knows it for him to make an about-face and become who he was meant to be. Finally, we arrive at Mother Abigail. Abigail is the spiritual ringleader and direct pipeline to the man upstairs for the ragtag group of do-gooders. Abigail is the force that brings them all together in the face of great adversity to stop their dark foe at any cost. The Antagonists. Lloyd Henreid is a lowly murderer with no moral compass or sense of regret. He finds himself in prison when the virus hits, and he grows desperate as it becomes clear that he has been left to die. However, he is given a chance to escape and to rise to a new level of villainy, the likes of which he had never dreamed. Nadine Cross is a conflicted woman who, despite knowing that what she is feeling and doing is wrong, seems helpless to avert her destiny. The forces that work to control her are unrelenting and eventually get the best of her, causing her to turn to the West and to the dark forces she has succumbed to. Harold Lauder is an outcast who longs for acceptance and tries in vain to ignore the dark impulses that cloud his mind. Despite his best efforts, he is too far gone, and with the aid of Nadine Cross, he is pushed into the arms of the awaiting darkness. Donald Merwin Elbert, better known as the Trash Can Man, is a tormented soul whose life has been one of constant turmoil and bullying. He has developed a penchant for pyromania over the years, but his obsession with fire can only keep his inner demons at bay for so long. I want to mention here that Trash Can Man is one of the most unfortunate characters in the novel. He is mentally ill as a result of lifelong abuse and neglect, and he has, through no fault of his own, become an unstable, volatile man who is irreparably damaged, which leaves him easily manipulatable, leaves him easily manipulated and a willing participant in the Dark Man's malevolent scheme. It seems so unfair, but I suppose fate and those who decide it have no time for trivialities like what is just or fair. Lastly is the Man in Black, the walking dude, the ageless stranger himself, Randall Flagg. Flagg is the antithesis of Mother Abigail and a conduit for evil. Flagg isn't the devil himself, but rather he is a henchman of hell and the literal embodiment of corruption. He is the seemingly unstoppable leader of the Las Vegas cult of miscreants and wrongdoers, but his power can be diminished and his stronghold broken. Final thoughts. The Stand is a novel that has stood the test of time, a story that has endured for over 4 decades and has remained one of King's best-selling, most influential novels over the course of his expansive career. Far beyond being a mere post-apocalyptic horror story, The Stand is a bird's-eye view of the warring factions of heaven and hell, as well as a microscope's view of the inner battles that rage within the mortals caught in the theological crossfire, whether they are cognizant of it or not. There is, however, one final lesson that The Stand can teach us, which is that in the face of adversity and insurmountable odds, humanity will come together and confront the challenges ahead as a unified force. That in times of suffering and devastation, societies will form and band together in an effort to build, improve, and amend the atrocities and injustices they have faced. Unless they're evil. Because if they're evil, they will actively try to make things worse and plot to destroy the residents of Boulder, Colorado specifically. But technically, the humans in The Stand never really had control of the outcome, and we're just spokes on the wheel of Ka. So the broader moral of the story is, the point King was trying to make was, well, I guess it's complicated, isn't it? New videos drop on this channel every Saturday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and next week I will take a look at the 1994 The Stand TV miniseries, which is not without its flaws, but is still considered to be one of the greatest King adaptations of all time. And for good reason. Okay, goodbye. Please be sure to click like and subscribe to the channel for my continued analysis of all things Stephen King, pretty please with blood and guts on top. My name is Mr. Doyle, and this has been a great undertaking.